Hello and welcome to our Science and Knowledge program here on TVR Cluj, Romania for the first time.
Hi there, Cristian. How are you doing?
I am excellent and I am so happy that we are now recording for the first time this interview with you.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dear Mr. Joseph Ohayon, please tell us what was the motivation which actually led you to this amazing documentary.
I would answer this with a question, I think. First of all, what's a better motivation, I think, than the realization that our world today is indeed at a very unique crossroads, and that contributing to the birth of a new worldview these days is really so inextricably tied to our better collective future. That, I think, kind of summarizes it. But if we want to, I can expand a bit more. I can say that definitely the film deals with questions that I personally was grappling with, pretty much since I know myself. Things like how is it that our world is structured the way it is, and does it have to be that way? Our social system, social institutions, economic system, education, why does it set up specifically the way it is? Who or what is the reason for things being shaped the way they are? I was always wondering about these things, the factors behind shaping human behavior, for instance, and also how all of that fits into nature, because essentially, as much as we're, like it or not, aware of it or not, we human beings are part of nature. And if there is an evolutionary process in nature, just like any other created beings, we humans are evolving as well. So how do we fit within that evolutionary process? And so I was always asking these questions, and I'm still asking them. And, the common answer you get is, at least from my experience, is, that's the way things are. Our world works the way it does, and it operates the way it does because that's the way it is. And I was never satisfied with that. I was never happy to end it there. And so I do my best to combine the media work that I'm doing together with sort of my quest for answers. I have to say, I didn't set out to make this film from the get-go, from the beginning, in the traditional sense of, okay, this is the film I want to do, here's my story, this is the idea, I'm going to interview this and that scientists and thinkers and this and that, and no, it wasn't like that at all. It was actually more like a discovery in a sense. It was more like I sort of began to see, I think, doing some other work and research, I started seeing kind of connecting threads between the world's growing interdependence on the one hand and this sort of self-centered culture that we've built that is reaching extremes in many ways, and how these two are really driving crises that we see escalating in every realm of human engagement, and also the fact that we are social beings and very much influenced by our environment, and that natural evolutionary process that we're all in. And I was starting to see connections between all of those things, like a through line. And then when it suddenly hit me that all of these things, the interdependence, the crisis, this culture of egoism, the natural evolutionary process, the social influence mechanism that is so pervasive, I started to see that this is all one thing, that this is really, it's one story. And then I said, here's my film. And pretty much, I guess that's what I would say.
I was so amazed by the film that when a friend of mine from Facebook sent me the link, and after a few seconds watching this film, I instantly felt that I have to see the movie completely. And it was a revelation for me. Mankind seems to be on the edge of a transformation, and what are the signs which tell us or will tell us when this process begins? What do you think?
If you look at, things like the Club of Rome or the Club of Budapest and so on, then you see that there are people, scientists, who have been talking about some transformation of human civilization even 20 and 30, maybe even close to 40 years ago. I tend to see this in many different scientists and thinkers alluding to that, even, as I said, 20 or 30 years ago. I see it personally as a process of convergence, meaning that there are several things that are happening at the same time, and they're sort of coming to a meeting point. If you look at the data and you see some reports, and you just see what is happening with the world, then you realize there's definitely an escalating crisis today in pretty much every realm of human engagement. One of the reports that is described in the film in Crossroads is the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report, where there's this risks interconnection map that is being shown. And this clearly shows how societal risks and economic risks and technological risks and environmental risks and so on, these are all interrelated issues. So what is happening is that these crises are escalating in many different levels. On the other hand, all of these levels are connected. You can't really separate between the natural system and the economy, which is how we use the natural system in many ways, and our social values and what happens in society and social problems and social gaps and so on, and our psychology and our emotions and our actions, and therefore, our behavior and all our systems. So you have a crisis happening in many levels. All these levels are interconnected, and essentially this renders our systems unstable. And yet, what I also saw is that at the same time, there's also a new awareness that I, at least from my view, see that it is really growing these days, in the last few years, I would say. And it's an awareness of how interdependent we are. You see many scientists from many different realms of science finding these indications of this more and more. You see many activists or people who are just curious about the world starting to develop this awareness of sort of a global society in a way. And so I think, and also the awareness that there is some fundamental value shift that needs to happen these days in order for us to really solve all those problems that I mentioned before. So I think the escalating crises, the interdependence, and this new awareness of a fundamental shift that has to take place, all these things to me are sort of indications that we're in this crossroads in human development.
The movie also talks about the perception. And the first part of the film, I had discovered the idea that behavior is transmitted in network and not just one individual. Can you elaborate more on this topic?
This is really fascinating. I would say that there is perhaps a socio-psycho-neurological network that is literally connecting us. If you look at social psychology, let's say that the past 60 years of social psychology, from that 1951 Ash experiment that I review in the film, so if you look at from then until today, pretty much 60 years, then you have so much evidence today from social psychology, just like this Ash experiment, the bystander effect, the Milgram experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, and all the work that the amazing psychologist Philip Zimbardo is doing. You see that from the side of psychology, really, you see that we as humans are so social beings, we're so influenced by our society that it's on every level: cognition, perception, development, our choices, our tastes, our priorities, our preferences, they're all completely influenced by our environment. So this is social psychology. And this is still looking at individuals as individuals. If you look at social network analysis, this branch of network science, then there's this growing understanding today of humans as an organism, as James Fowler calls it the human superorganism. James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis, which are also speaking in the film. And actually, their research is so, if you really conceive of what it means, it's really mind-blowing. I think it bears repeating. They actually took data that was collected for 32 years. It was a heart study, actually, that was tracking people. For 32 years, they were tracking 12,000 people who lived there in Framingham, and they were asking these people all of the questions you can think of, and measuring their weight and their height and their physical measurements, and asking them about their preferences and their choices and what they do in life and where they work, and most importantly, their social ties, who they're connected to. And they kept tracking this data of 12,000 individuals in that same city for 32 years. And what sociologists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler did is they took all that data and they applied statistics, and what they started to see is that all this data has revealed this amazing picture of networks, that humans are actually changing their preferences and tastes and choices, and they get sick or they get well, they get married, they get divorced, they start smoking, they stop smoking. All these things happen in groups. And so they started seeing that there's actually statistics here that you can't argue with. And so this is kind of, on the social and psychological perspective. We also have the growing understanding today of how environment is a major factor in biology as well. You mentioned Bruce Lipton. Well, he was talking about this 40-something years ago when he was running his stem cell experiments, and he discovered how stem cells are influenced by their environments. And back then, it was hard for him to even explain it to his colleagues, because it was so against the really a dogma in biology of what's called genetic determinism. And so today there is what's called epigenetics, meaning this idea that the environment decides what genes will be muted or will be activated, and so the environment has a factor of influence there. And if you look at neuroscience today, then neuroscientists are telling us that there's this subset of neurons called mirror neurons. It really is fascinating, because what it's saying really is that not just when I make an action, but if you make an action and I look at you, then the same neurons fire. And so what is happening, if you think about it, is that we are constantly communicating with each other. Our brains are learning from each other, imitating each other, adopting each other's point of view, and this communication, whether we are aware of it or not, and it happens without our awareness, is happening. And so if you put all those things together and you say, okay, so from sociology and from psychology and from network science and from neuroscience and from biology, if you put all those things together and you say, okay, so what is a human being really outside of an environment? Is there really such a thing? Can we think about when I get... It changes our entire way of looking at things, because when I get sick or when I get sad or when I become happy, when I feel good, when I feel bad, when we think of solving problems in life, in our personal life, social life, or global situations, how can we detach an individual problem or an individual and his behavior, his or her behavior, from the environment that they are part of? You really see that you can't do it. And what is even more interesting is that if you look at nature, meaning the other levels of nature, other than the human level, if you look at animals and plants, then you see that this is really old news. This is nothing new, that species work in a collective manner, and they have some sort of a collective, I don't know how to call it, collective intelligence or a collective behavior. If you look at, schools of fish or flocks of birds.
The so-called superorganism or collective super-organizations.
Yeah, and even if you look at your body, look at our bodies. It's say 100 trillion cells working so harmoniously and connected in a collective type of manner. And then if you look at all those, superorganisms, as you said, then you realize it's not that far-fetched to see humanity as a network. And again, the data, I really recommend for anyone who's not familiar to read James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis' book, Connected. And it describes their research in detail, and you realize that we have the illusion that we are separate from the environment and that we have our own choices and our own behavior and our own feelings, but really they're all contingent upon the environment on so many levels that you really can't separate an individual from their environment.
Rupert Sheldrake had a very special research 20 or 30 years ago about how the behavior of past and present organisms are influencing the behavior of future generations. Like, for example, not very long time ago, he made an experiment with monkeys to wash bananas which were given to them dirty in sand, and they did not like to eat bananas with sand. But one of them suddenly began to have this idea to go to a water flow and wash the banana, and after a while, when a critical mass percentage was attained, all the other monkeys, without any other teachings, began to wash bananas, and more than that, in few years, all monkeys from the same species all over the world began to wash banana. This is what he called the morphic field or the morphogenetic theory, morphic resonance.
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Dr. Sheldrake is really another great example of a person who discovered that, the unfortunate reality that the scientific community is also very influenced by, by dogma, which doesn't allow science to freely progress and explore new realms. And he has a book he just released, I think a couple months ago, maybe a year ago. It's called Science Set Free. And it's really interesting where he writes specifically about that. What I tried to bring in the film is sort of like the more, understandable and easy to digest ideas of how we humans are really connected as a network. But it's true that there is so much more to the connection, to those ties that tie us together. And this just requires more and more scientists to go out there and research these things. And again, as I said, unfortunately, not every scientist has sort of the legitimacy to do it, because every new thing in science also has its own kind of, way of, until it becomes sort of the conventional type of area of research. And so I think it's a very interesting process what is happening today, both in the world and in how we understand what is happening in society and what scientists are going through today. I would say that science today is also at a crossroads.
One of the amazing parts of this film is talking about a recent discovery called minority rule. And I believe through this kind of documentaries, we might be able to create the critical mass of 10% in order to promote a new thinking and a healthy way of life. This would be really amazing if we can participate to create a critical mass in developing this new thinking and new way of life.
I'm fascinated and inspired by the immense opportunity that we have here. And, you know, I think when you talk to people sometimes and you know, you talk about social change or global change, and people think, yeah, but what can I do, you know, and I'm just one person, and, you know, and the world is so big, and these problems are so great and everything. While I definitely understand it, this is an attitude and an approach that comes from not understanding just how much we are all connected and dependent on each other. If you realize that everything you think, do, and feel, and how you behave, and what you say, and how what you tell others, you're influencing not just your own thoughts and feelings and behaviors and emotions, but just by the fact of changing your own worldview, you're already changing other people, and you don't even know how far that spreads, because these things have a conscious effect and a subconscious effect, because we are, as we said before, we are like networks of humans. We are never individual humans. And so that ripple effect is happening whether you are aware of it or not. So what we're saying is, let's become aware of it. Let's start being active and be aware of one, that we're all connected, two, that we're all interdependent, and three, if we realize that we're connected and dependent on each other, let's start using this in a positive way. Let's start changing the values, changing the thinking, and creating the basis for a new culture that will later allow us to create lasting solutions for the problems that we have today. Also, that change doesn't happen necessarily in a linear fashion. The way we normally think of things, you know, we need to influence one person, then another person, then another person, then another person. What this research of the 10% critical mass shows is that really it's nothing new. If you look at biological evolution and you see how there's this leaps of evolution, how there's a catastrophe that usually precedes a big step in evolution, then if you look at these things and you put them together, then you realize we have a lot of power because we are connected and dependent on each other. Every individual makes a difference, and the change is one of critical mass. It doesn't have to be all the people at the same time, but there needs to be a critical mass of people who change their ways and their values in order to influence all of society at large.
This is absolutely fascinating what you are talking. I remember that Princeton University had conducted an experiment for over 10 or 20 years called the Global Consciousness Project.
They have these detectors that are spread around the Earth for many years now, and random number generators.
Yes, including one in my city, in Cluj.
This is one of those things that, you know, not a lot of scientists are researching that, but if you look at the results of what they're bringing, these are statistics that are hard to argue with, and it's hard to say that there's no, that this is not showing something. It's indeed showing something.
Very fascinating. And I remember something recently when I was watching a conference where Richard Dawkins presented something about Darwinism and evolution versus creation, and he said the following, which is very important. I am very much hoping that we don't preserve to the idea of survival of the fittest in planning our politics and our values and our way of life. To live our lives in a Darwinian way, to make a society as a Darwinian society, that would be a very unpleasant society in which to live. And he said that on the atheism debate, Richard Dawkins versus Cardinal George Pell in 2012. On the other hand, Bruce Lipton said that in nature there is a cooperation issue rather than fighting for survivors, or our society should develop itself within a conscious behavior, not an automated subconscious reaction to the environment in creating a struggle for existence. This is a very good argument.
You mentioned evolution of cooperation. There's there's actually a book called Super Cooperators by a Professor Martin Nowak, if you're familiar with that. He's a professor in Harvard University, and he's teaching both biology and mathematics. And it's really interesting because he lays out a mathematical argument that shows how it's really looking at survival of the fittest as, you know, the drive of evolution is really just a partial, it's a part of the picture. What is really happening is that there is a bigger evolution of cooperation that is happening, and that if we specifically as humans as well, he calls us super cooperators, and that's the title of his book, and he says that he shows mathematically how we couldn't survive if we wouldn't be growing our cooperation. And so regarding what is happening today, it's really interesting because if you think about, again, all the problems that we're facing, then you can say, man, the world is just, it's a lost case. It's just getting, you know, worse and worse. And the economic system is getting so unstable, what we're doing to the environment, ecology, look at this, the social gaps and social inequality, and all the and political corruption, people protesting all over the world, depression rates are still rising, health problems prevail, and so on. If you look at it this way, it seems like, you know, we're not going towards some good transformation here. There's nothing better. It's just getting worse and worse. But if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, adding to it, for instance, what evolutionary biologist Elizabeth Sahtouris explains, that in order to reach higher levels of cooperation, there has to be deeper levels of conflict. And so what this would mean about our society today is that now we have to reach a higher level of cooperation in the global sense. Because all the problems that we have today, you will not be able to solve the economic problem if you don't solve it globally. At the end of the day, you won't be able to solve the environment problems that we have, climate change and global warming and so on, if there won't be global cooperation. We won't be able to solve, you know, the problem of security in one country without solving it in between all the countries. So it seems that the situation we are at right now is like a step before we move towards more cooperation, global cooperation. How exactly will that happen? You know, what will be the exact steps? You know, I don't know. But if you look at evolution, and if you look at what's happening today in science, and if you look at the new awareness that we talked about before, that more and more people are starting to see this picture of the interdependent world, and if you put all those things together, and that critical mass that we were talking about, then this gives a much more hopeful picture of the future than a gloomy, dark vision of reality.
Please make us a conclusion. What is the main message of the film? What should the viewers pay attention to?
Okay, so to try to that's actually not such a simple question to answer for me. I think the film is an attempt to, or can help you sort of have a prism to see many things that are happening today in the world and how they relate to our personal life, the growing interdependence we see in the world, the escalating crises, we as discovering ourselves more and more as social beings, and connecting all of that with the natural evolutionary process that we're going through. Hopefully the film will help you see all these things as one thing, as sort of see the through line that goes through all of these different components, connecting them to one. And I think the main message is, if we really want to change anything for the better, whether it's in our personal life or on the global scale, every interaction that you have with your environment, I would even say your social environment, is constantly in a process of a feedback loop with you. We're constantly learning from the environment and giving to the environment. And what we have the ability to do, and I hope this is something that comes across from the film, is influence that feedback loop and begin to inspire it with new values, with values that will make our lives better, paying attention to the connection between us as a new source of fulfillment, and finding joy and pleasure and meaning in that.
I thank you a lot for allowing us to show this film in Romania.